Hello everyone, my name is Deep Pal and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Washington DC based National Bureau of Asian Research. I work on China's relations with India as well as its evolving role in South Asia. Now, recently I wrote an article for Carnegie India on the health diplomacy that we have seen China initiate globally during the coronavirus pandemic and what that means and what shape that might take in the coming months and years. You can find a link to the article below in the description. Now, after writing the article, I have been getting a lot of questions about what this Belt and Road Initiative means. Why is it so important to China? What shape can it take because of the coronavirus pandemic? And how does that affect South Asia? So, what I'm going to try and do today in Carnegie Insights is answer some of these questions. So the first question is, what is this BRI or Belt and Road Initiative and why is it so important to China? Now, the Belt and Road Initiative was launched in 2013 as China's flagship foreign policy initiative, and it is super ambitious in scale. It envisages a network of infrastructure projects which will be spread across the globe, for which China has partnered with multiple countries. And Chinese banks have also given out billions of dollars in loans because they are supposed to serve a very important set of purposes for China. For one, it will connect China to the world better than it has ever been connected. That is important because, as we know, China is the manufacturing hub for the world, and its supply chains will be better served by such a network. But there are other reasons as well, which are equally, if not more important. China hopes to alter the way the world has been designed since the Industrial Revolution, which is essentially the West being the center and the rest of the world being connected to it. With the BRI, China hopes to turn this entire model on its head. Now, China will be the center, and the rest of the world that will be connected to it. Now, this works with the image that China has of itself, and it has been keen to convey to the rest of the world that it has arrived on the global scene. It is no longer a weak state, and the rest of the world must respect this strength that China finds itself in. Along with this, the BRI is also supposed to help with another goal, that of national renewal or national rejuvenation that China talks about. Now, China has set certain goals for itself. Some of these goals are supposed to be achieved by 2021, that is next year, when the Chinese Communist Party is 100 years old. And the other goals are supposed to be achieved by 2049, which is when the People's Republic of China reaches 100 years. And Xi Jinping has himself articulated and set these goals. They are called the two-century goals, and they are very important both domestically as well as internationally for China. Now, the BRI is connected to both these set of goals, both internationally as well as domestically. We know that the Chinese economy has been growing in double digits since the end of the 1970s or early 1980s. But in the last few years, we have seen that slow down quite a bit. The BRI is supposed to help Chinese economy gain momentum once again. That's one. The other part is that the success of the BRI is essential for the Communist Party to stay in control. Because as we have seen in the last few decades, especially since the 1989 Tiananmen incident, higher the economic growth and standard of living and economic prosperity for the people, lower the internal protests and questions that the Communist Party faces. Now, the BRI is also funded by Chinese banks. The funding pattern is not very transparent, not very clear, but we do know that agencies like the China Development Bank, like the Export-Import Bank of China, they have put down billions in dollars in funding BRI projects across the globe. And they have done this with the expectation that once these projects are completed, they are going to have robust return on investments. Now, around 70 countries have signed up for the BRI so far. In India's neighborhood in South Asia, these include Bangladesh, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, where infrastructure projects like roadways, railways, ports, airports are being built with Chinese support. Even projects that were planned before the BRI was announced, even projects that were planned or even launched or discussed before the BRI, all of them are now slowly being brought under the BRI umbrella. What all of this essentially means is that COVID or no COVID, the BRI is not just simply another project that China can abandon by the wayside once the going gets tough. There is simply too much riding on this, which is the reason why China has to find newer ways to keep this initiative relevant and going in the post pandemic world. Because remember, during that period of time, as we study after study has told us, there will be slow to negative economic growth across the world, which means there will be far less capital available to both China and the BRI partner countries. And also the priorities of these countries is going to change. All this while they were very happy with infrastructure projects. They thought that is what they needed. But now while they will want those bridges and highways and roads, they will also want to ramp up their health infrastructure. They will want research facilities and they will want hospitals. And that is something that China will have to reckon with. The next question that we're going to look at is how is this COVID-19 crisis going to affect the BRI or even change it? So, as we know, this coronavirus crisis has affected China in multiple ways. For one, its image has taken a huge beating. It has been accused of misleading the world about the severity of this virus. At the same time, the BRI itself is also stalled because of the epidemic. It is usually Chinese workers that man these projects that are taking place across the world. Because of lockdowns and aircrafts that have stopped flying, they haven't been able to reach the project sites in various countries. At the same time, in fact, some workers that had managed to reach project sites were quarantined in the early days of the virus. So, what does China want out of this episode? If you look at comments from Chinese leaders or even at the Chinese press, you will find that there are at least three objectives that are being talked about, that are being indicated multiple times. The first of them is this need to fix its image. China wants to seize the narrative around its role and fix its image that has taken this beating. And there are two ways in which it is going to do that, or it is trying to do that, in fact, right now. The first one is being called mask diplomacy, which is basically helping countries, if Chinese media is to be believed, over 130 countries with supplying medical equipment such as PPEs or testing kits or ventilators and other such things, with helping some of these countries with expert advice from doctors. And in some cases, like in the case of Pakistan, even helping them build makeshift field hospitals. And every time a plane load of equipment takes off from one of the Chinese airports, there is a storm of press reports, there is a storm of social media posts and commentary about this help that China is giving out to the world. And the second one is being called Wolf Warrior diplomacy. Now, Wolf Warrior is a very famous Chinese movie, hugely popular, and this form of diplomacy gets its name from this movie. Now, Chinese diplomats have usually had very benign kind of statement makers. But under Wolf Warrior diplomacy, what we have seen happen is these same diplomats or even the foreign ministry in China defend China's position and role on the pandemic aggressively and repeatedly. In the last few months, we have seen Chinese missions and Chinese diplomats across the world open multiple social media accounts, like on Twitter and Facebook. And what they do is they use them repeatedly and very effectively. In some cases, they are benign. Like in the case of Nepal, we saw the Chinese ambassador to Nepal tweet about the crisis in Nepal, about the coronavirus crisis in Nepal, and say that, the Nepali are never going to find themselves alone. Now, if you go to Twitter and look at this post, you will see that at least as far as the people of Nepal that are on Twitter, they have appreciated this, they have thanked her immensely. However, a lot of this wolf warrior diplomacy is not so benign. Diplomats have aggressively pushed the idea that the coronavirus originated outside China. In fact, they went on to hint that it was possibly the US Army that brought the virus to China. They have vehemently opposed this virus being called the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus in some countries. And in some places, in some countries, they have even written to public representatives insisting that they be thanked, that is, China be thanked publicly for rendering all the help that it has rendered during this crisis. Now, China's second objective is to use this crisis to expand its global footprint and shape multilateral organizations in a way in which it is comfortable with. Now, for the longest time, China did not really want to step out of its boundaries or expand to take global roles. But that has changed in the last few years. It has emerged at leadership positions in at least four UN bodies. It almost reached the leadership position in a fifth UN body. More so, we are seeing the the United States retreating from the global scene in a way. The latest instance being withdrawal from the World Health Organization, and China has decided that it is going to move in to fill in at least part of this strategic space that has been vacated. Now, take the instance of the WHO, for example. It has been criticized for its response to the virus. It is scrambling to show leadership at this time when it most needs to. And China, through its program of medical assistance and healthcare aid, is trying to take up where the world body has faltered. In fact, it has even has a name for this part of its actions. It calls this the Health Silk Road, and it is suggested to be a part of the BRI. And the Health Silk Road, in fact, was first suggested and came out in the open in 2017. But this is the first time that we are actually seeing China act aggressively in this way, in the health sphere. Now, there is every possibility that even after the pandemic is over, China is going to continue to help countries with their healthcare infrastructure needs. Now, this brings us to China's third objective, which is basically the keeping the BRI going on in newer ways, adapting to the newer realities after the pandemic ends. The BRI partner countries, as we have discussed, are going to continue to want the roads and rails and bridges and all of that they earlier have asked for. But along with that, they will also want to improve their healthcare infrastructure. And that is where the Health Silk Road initiative comes in. For China to have newer markets for its healthcare systems as well as for its technology. It can offer healthcare infrastructure developments to these countries. It can collaborate in research in biomedical technology or synthetic biology, in which it has made great strides. It can offer diagnostic tools. It can offer pharmaceuticals. It can offer its own contact tracing apps. It can offer telemedicine. And along with all of this, for things like telemedicine or some of these collaborations to work, it can even offer its 5G communication networks through companies like Huawei, which have faced and are possibly going to face a lot of roadblocks in other parts of the world, like in the West. Now, along with this, it also seems that this Health Silk Road is going to be funded in much the same way as the BRI has been funded. China has already given Sri Lanka a $500 million loan to combat COVID-19. Now, this possibly creates a model of funding in situations such as future global health crises. The next question then is what does this mean for BRI partner countries, including those in South Asia? Does this mean that they will have to be indebted to China in newer ways? And the answer to that is not necessarily. Things may go about in various different ways. For one, a lot of countries have been objecting to parts of the BRI or things about the BRI even before this current crisis. For one, there have been protests against the Chinese practice of using only Chinese laborers in these projects. Now, local communities and authorities across the world have claimed that this does nothing for the places where these projects are taking place. Now, Chinese companies fund these projects, and therefore the return on investment goes to these very companies. At the same time, when Chinese people come in and they work in these projects, it does not even create any jobs for the local populace. As such, it becomes very difficult to support the idea of having these projects disrupting people's lives for multiple years as they go on. But a bigger problem with the BRI that most of the countries so far have raised is that of the issue of the inability to service loans. Now, many projects in the BRI that were suggested to have a very good return of investments have not really lived up to those levels of expectations. After the pandemic, as we have mentioned, there will be even less capital in the global system, which means projects will be delayed even further, and more countries are going to be debt ridden for a longer period of time, and they will be unable to service these loans. This has already started happening. A number of countries have reached out to China asking for some kind of debt relief. Countries like Kyrgyzstan, the Maldives, and Sri Lanka are even negotiating about debt restructuring. But of course, there's a limit to how much Chinese banks that have their money and huge amounts of money tied up to these projects can do as well. So what will eventually happen is that at some point in time, the Chinese government will have to take a call. Do they want to antagonize BRI partner countries to the point where there is a risk of them pulling out altogether? Or do they want to change some of the terms of the loan, some of the terms of these projects, give out as much relief as they can so that these countries stay in and the BRI stays alive in maybe a reduced form, but alive nonetheless? The other question then is what can India do, both in the near term and in the longer term? Now, it has already been doing something. So, as far as the COVID crisis is concerned, in the immediate neighborhood, in the near term, it has used its own commercial as well as Air Force aircrafts to evacuate nationals belonging to Bangladesh, the Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. The people from these countries that were stuck in various countries, India has actually brought them back from those countries and sent them to their respective homes. It has also used its Navy ships for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions. It has used them to take food grains, medical aid, as well as team of doctors to a number of places, which include Comoros, Madagascar, the Maldives, and the Seychelles. It has also sent out medicines, most significantly hydroxychloroquine tablets, to almost 100 countries after they proved to be promising in treating the virus. Along with all of this, it is also building up alliances. For example, along with the Quad countries, it has joined New Zealand, South Korea, and Vietnam to collaborate efforts to contain the virus. Now, this is surely for the current crisis, but at the same time, there is a distinct possibility that such groupings, including this one, will operate even beyond the pandemic. And in the longer term, it will have to find ways of keeping these initiatives going, as well as go back to the earlier initiatives like the Asia Africa Growth Corridor that it spearheaded with Japan to work in the region. So these are some of the steps that India can look at. Having said all of this, though, as we know, no other country has the kind of resources that China has. A lot will depend on what China wants to do, how far it wants to go with the Health Silk Road, how much money it is willing to spend, how much debt relief it is comfortable with for these countries, and how quickly it can do all of this. It also means that in this current environment of wolf warrior diplomacy, coupled with all the issues that China is having the world over, be it the new national security law for Hong Kong, be it the stance that it has taken on Taiwan's participation in global public health, the standoff with India in the line of actual control, and above all, the fact that China US relations are the worst that they have been in many, many years currently. So China will have to decide how it is going to balance its aspirations with the inevitable need to prioritize foreign policy goals.